morning, everyone, and welcome to our collective bargaining webinar. We will be speaking about the state of collective bargaining in South Africa so far and how to handle the challenges. Just to highlight that the session will be recorded this morning, and also we invite you to please use our Q&A function. If you have any comments or questions, please drop it in the Q&A. And once again, thank you so much for joining us. Felicity, over to you. Felicity, you on mute.
Right, the Zoom folly. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're expecting quite a large group, and so we are looking forward to engaging with everybody this morning. I have with me this morning Robin Monakali, my colleague, who's our project coordinator in conflict dynamics and who will be managing the webinar for us. Then we have Tony Healy, who's a labor law consultant, Mahamed Rajah, who is an accredited commercial mediator, coach and assessor, and a part-time senior commissioner with CCMA and bargaining councils, and a conflict dynamics panelist. He's a trainer, facilitator, and mediator with conflict dynamics. William Thomson, also an accredited mediator and coach, part-time senior CCMA commissioner and bargaining council commissioner, works also with conflict dynamics as a panelist, and he's also a practicing attorney. And I'm very, very proud to say that all of our three speakers today are very long-standing colleagues of mine, going back very many years. William back to the early 80s, and Tony in the 80s, and Mahamed perhaps in the 90s through IMSA. So it's a really special pleasure to be working with them again today. And I will hand over to them each in due course. I'm a director of conflict dynamics, and together with John Brand, we established conflict dynamics in 1996. We provide training services and more recently facilitation and mediation services. And most of our work is in the industrial relations, labor relations arena. And this is an area that we have a deep passion for because all of us in the business come from that background of industrial relations back in the 1980s. And I was just remembering with my colleagues before we started what it was like in the 1980s. Well, first of all, the context was deep apartheid. And so everything was informed by the situation, the political situation at the time, which was extremely challenging, very difficult, and for trade unions and management, particularly challenging. As I recall, interest rates, I think we bought our first house, interest rates were around about 24%, inflation was in the high teens, and of course there was a massive legacy that unions were attempting to challenge around low wages and discrimination in the workplace. So demands, wage demands were very, very high. Literally in the 90%, 100%, extremely high, in an effort largely to redress the imbalance of the past. And also because, as we know, the workplace was very much a kind of site of struggle in the 80s and the early 90s as we moved towards the transition in the 90s. So as a labor relations practitioner, industrial relations advisor and negotiator at that time, we were faced, when I was working in the Premier Group, with extremely high demands from trade unions and very, very difficult negotiations. And settlement rates were in the high teens, really all part of that jostle between capital and labor in those days, correcting really the legacy that we had brought upon ourselves. Things have changed in many respects. The numbers are lower, but the level of conflict is not necessarily lower. There are still a high, perhaps not as high as in the 80s, but high rates of industrial action, and usually accompanied by violence, which makes it extremely challenging. We are interested as conflict dynamics in this scenario because we want to make a contribution in whatever way we can to stabilize the current labor relations situation, particularly through training and then through facilitation and mediation. And all of my colleagues here are intensely involved in those activities. Just last week, William and Mahamed were working with a very important client on their labor relationship and achieved an amazing outcome in stabilizing that relationship. Let me turn, Robin, to my slides and go through these quite quickly. They are going to be repeated and expanded upon by my colleagues, but I wanted to just sort of set the context very, very briefly. And as I say, my colleagues will expand, particularly Tony, on these points. I described the economy back in the 80s. Well, we still have a huge economic challenge. As I said, the figures might be lower, but in relation to other things going on in the economy and in relation to the world, which is in crisis itself in these respects, we face rising inflation, rising interest rates, and in South Africa, a terrible mix of unemployment and poverty. Both of which, those two last points, really haven't changed much over the last couple of decades. There's been a significant increase in industrial action since the end of lockdown. And here we've had a look at the figures produced by the Department of Labour, as well as Andrew Levy's recent diagnosis or research into what is going on. Andrew Levy is an amazing source of data about industrial relations trends. The strikes, the industrial action that is taking place is primarily strikes as opposed to lockouts, mostly unprotected with associated violence. Union demands are growing, settlement rates are rising, and they're higher than inflation. And I wondered if at this moment we could do our first couple of polls, Robin. Let's get a sense from our 38 participants so far of how they are experiencing the labor relations context. So our first poll asks about union demands. So what was the opening wage demand by the union in your organization this year? So please just vote. Let's get a sense from our group here of what the trend in your organization was. Just pick one, it's a single choice poll. We got some responses yet?
Yes, we do. They're streaming in.
Great. Once they slow down, perhaps you can reveal them.
Sure, I'm going to end the poll and share the results.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, very interesting. And okay, so in the 10 to 14% dominant. Okay, thank you, that's interesting. Now let's have a look at what employers have responded with as their first offer. And the reason why I'm asking this is because one of the contributions we as Conflict Dynamics hope to make is through our training, is to assist parties think through their negotiation strategy. Where do they start? How do they start in their demands and offers? What information and preparation do they need to start in an effective way? And then what are the moves from then? Is it a case, as we saw in the 80s, of a massive, massive gap between opening demands and then a very slow and painful process of moving towards a point of settlement? Or has it improved? It's interesting to see that the union demands are in a lower range. let's have a look at the employer offers. And there's a lot that can be done to assist parties in this preparation process. Information, for example, and William will talk about what the Code of Good Practice talks about in relation to disclosure of information. The more information the parties have at the preparation stage, the better equipped they are to explain their demand and justify their demand. And actually, the more they know about one another before they start bargaining, the more they're able to frame a demand that is likely to be received better. So we're going to also talk about pre-negotiation meetings and perhaps facilitated pre-negotiation meetings where the parties get to learn a bit about one another, what's important this year. And on the basis of that conversation, then they would be in a position to frame their demands with better insights. So let's see the results here, Robin. Below 5%. Okay, is the very dominant one. Okay, so it was 5% and then between 10 and 14%. Am I right in saying that? I didn't write it down. Was that the union range? Colleagues, yeah, 10 to 14%. Okay, so that's a much more manageable range. Let's then have a look at the next question, the last question for the moment, and that's the settlement rate. What was the actual settlement in your organization, given that gap of, let's say, 14 to below 5? What was your actual settlement rate? And we do know, obviously, that collective bargaining is a process of negotiation, and parties expect to make a couple of moves towards the point of agreement. And it may or may not be associated with pain, with industrial action. Hopefully, it's more around an informed conversation, a discussion about what is possible, what workers can bear, what the organization can bear, in order that the mutual interests that they have are satisfied. Okay, so Kumlani has made a point about not settled yet. We realize a lot of people are in the throes of collective bargaining right now. Let's see what the settlement rate is for those who have settled. Between 5 and 9, okay. Between 5 and 9, okay. All right. Okay, so that's some useful, really useful data. I mean, it's quite close there, the 5, 0 to 5. So those are the settlement rates. So you've got to ask yourself the question, if you know that that is where it's going to settle, how do you get there with the least amount of damage to workers, i.e. no work, no pay, and to the organization, who, if there are costs associated with industrial action, which there usually are, that of course then diminishes the pot from which wage increases can be given, perhaps only next time round. Let me just go back to my slides quickly, and then I'm going to turn to Tony. Okay, so settlement rates are usually higher than inflation, and we know that inflation, I had a look yesterday, the figures I saw with Andrew Levy, he was talking around about, no, it was the CPI official figure at that point was around about 6%, but I have seen higher figures. So if our range here is between 5 and 9, then some of those higher ones are higher than inflation. And perhaps Tony can talk about what that means in terms of impact on the economy. Okay, settlements are usually achieved after industrial action has taken place. And so Robin, let's have the next poll, which has to do with industrial action. Yeah, just with or without. And we know, of course, industrial action is a legitimate means to push from the employer and the union side to achieve a settlement. It's unfortunate that the industrial action that we see is largely unprotected, and largely there's a high degree of violence associated with it. And as a consequence, we need to look to the code of good practice around the code for collective bargaining, around picketing and industrial action. And we need more recently to look at the new code, which is about economic protest action. So let's have a look at that result, Robin. Without, well, that is very, very pleasing. That is really good to see, 67% without industrial action. Of course, we are fed a very negative picture by the media. We see many of the big matters that took a long time to settle with protracted industrial action. And in some of those cases, and I know Tony's going to talk about this, the settlement after industrial action was one that was higher than what was last offered, which the fear is that rewards the industrial action. But of course, we know that the point about industrial action is to increase the offer. Okay, Robin, let me go to my last few points, and then I'm going to introduce Tony. Okay. A couple of extra points. It's interesting to see how union density is falling. If I think back to the 80s, where union density, union membership was rising enormously, that has fallen. There is also a lot of inter-union rivalry within organization that impacts collective bargaining, and also, and Mahamed, this was a point I picked up from your podcast, some of the rivalry between employers at bargaining council level, the employers' organizations, about the continuation of the bargaining council and their efficacy in collective bargaining. Our concern as conflict dynamics is around preparation and how the bargaining is happening. And this is, I think, because of poor preparation and because of a lack of skills generally across the board in negotiation. There's a great deal of what we call positional bargaining, high demands and creeping towards one another with positions not informed by what is really important to the parties, and then a rapid move to deadlock. So I want to now turn to my colleagues and hear more about these points in more detail, and also hear from them ideas that they have about how to address these challenges. And so I'm going to turn now to Tony, and Tony's going to talk from his experience as a consultant in this area, a consultant of many years standing. So welcome, Tony. Thank you.
Good morning, Felicity, and good morning, colleagues. It's great to be with you, and I look forward to the time that we're going to be spending together. Perhaps as a point of departure, just to echo one or two of the points that Felicity has made, I think if I look at our subject matter of collective bargaining in the current calendar year, I think that many of you will agree that it's very difficult to look at the South African collective bargaining environment in isolation of the broader societal, socio-economic, and even political influences that political issues that we are seeing. And if I do myself think back to the 1980s, for example, I remember, as some of you may have who are old enough to remember that, receiving requests for telegrams to be sent to government to release unionists and others that had been detained. And workers in those days would come to work, of course, with the socio-economic challenges that they faced, but also the political issues of political lacking political enfranchisement. And I think if I look at my experience in collective bargaining now, in many ways it's the same, in the sense that we still have a large portion of our workforce are disenchanted with government, but for different reasons, relating to, for example, service delivery, relating to crime and the like. So in my mind, when I'm involved in the collective bargaining process, wherever, one can't ignore the fact that a large percentage of the workers on whose behalf organized labor is bargaining, a large percentage of those workers are coming to work impoverished, faced with dramatic crime, worse than what I would experience in my neighborhood, growing sense of disenchantment with government, as I say, but for different reasons, spending large percentages of their income just getting to and from work, etc., etc., etc. So, no running water often, no electricity. So I'm not I'm not really a political animal, but you can't ignore those factors. And I think one can't ignore the fact that those stresses and strains are to some degree brought to and contaminate the collective bargaining process. So in many ways, not much has changed in the mindset of a worker who's coming to work in 2022 versus the mindset of a worker who's coming to work in 1982 or 1992. But I do have some thoughts I'd like to share with you, which hopefully will be of value and potentially generate some discussion. Robin, I wonder if you could just put up my first, and the first slide really relates to, and many of you will know this, in that when we enter a collective bargaining process, one of the things we do is we try to manage our own and our negotiating partners' expectations. And I think the same is necessary when you look at the current year. You have to look at it in context and say, what realistically could we have expected going into 2022? But because of course, it was very different. We were coming out of a COVID period and all the challenges we were faced. So heightened inflation, we've seen that. We've seen increasing interest rate cycles. And I think that's important when we talk about this term above inflation increases, because as we'll see shortly, many increases that have been agreed to and hyped as above inflation, 10 minutes after the ink has dried, they were no longer above inflation, they were below inflation. If we look at South Africa more so from a growth point of view, and again, many of you will be familiar with this, but once you strip out all the error factors and all the issues that need to be taken into consideration, South Africa's real growth rate has only been 1.6% per annum for that 10-year period between 2009 and 2019. Our exports are dropping, as you can see from the fact that our exports are now 0.4 rather than 0.6% globally. I come from the school of thought that says, whilst this is not a reason for unemployment, I do think, and whilst there is a need to protect employees, of course, I do come from a camp that says, nonetheless, that our labor law, employment law regime is more regulated than I think is required, especially for now. I saw Tito Mboweni not so long ago tweet, and I was interested to see it. He tweeted something along the lines of the fact that the labor legislation that we introduced necessarily in the mid-90s is not necessarily entirely fit for purpose now in a South Africa that's doubled in unemployment since those years. We mustn't forget, when we talk about the unemployment rate, that South Africa's unemployment, or that the ANC inherited an unemployment rate north of 20% in 1994. It's doubled since then. And as Tito Mboweni said not so long ago, perhaps they're not entirely fit for purpose, given the extraordinary challenges we face with regards to, for example, unemployment. Our trading partners are in or are likely to go into recession. We have the impact of the COVID years, which we're all highly aware of, and we will have lived and experienced in terms of the retrenchments wage decreases, wage freezes and the like. I saw a statistic yesterday that our GDP, given the impact of COVID, has been zero in the last 2 years. And then, of course, as far as the public sector is concerned, and we can talk a little bit about that in a second, but many of you will know of the fact that through the courts, the public sector 3-year deal, everybody ummed and ahed about that in the courts, depending which court you went to, but ultimately it was held that government did not need to implement the year 3 increment in their 3-year wage agreement. I thought that was interesting. I thought it was the wrong call. I thought it undermined collective bargaining as a process. I fully understood that, as many of you may have, of course, that circumstances had changed dramatically. How could the state afford this 3rd year of this agreement and the increment, and was it properly mandated or wasn't it, etc., etc. But I did feel, nonetheless, that it undermined the collective bargaining process and would have done harm to the collective bargaining process, especially in the public sector. And I think we're seeing that, and we'll come back to that in a second. I think we're seeing that being vented in the current, and maybe even rightfully so, being vented in the current round of public sector wage negotiations that we're going through with the likelihood or with the potential, I think, of a probable strike. So I think for me, going into 2022, if we were realistic, we would have had to have said to ourselves it was going to be a relatively bumpy ride. And I don't think we're seeing that just in South Africa. We're seeing it elsewhere. We're seeing it in the UK where lost ground is being sought to be recovered by Labour for lost years, the lost years of 2021 in particular. So, Robin, thank you. Perhaps we can have a look now at what we're seeing in the currently this year, and there are other issues that impact on how the collective bargaining process is unfolding, and indeed industrial action for that matter. And many of you will know that since the evolution of SAF2, the split of COSATU, the evolution of SAF2, we're moving away from one union, one industry. We're seeing greater fragmentation in the trade union movement. That is leading to greater union rivalry. That in itself also is leading to or evolving into scenarios of a greater likelihood of there being proliferation of trade unions in single workplaces, and that doesn't augur well for industrial peace, and it doesn't augur well for the collective bargaining process. And maybe one final point before I look at some of these issues in more detail. My sense of collective bargaining is that you can't buy industrial peace. If I cast my mind back to when I was not in private practice, but in corporate life, I worked for employers that were paying big numbers in terms of minimum wages. I worked for employers that were paying, other businesses resented them for doing so because they set the bar so high. And yet, and notwithstanding that, the fact that those businesses had amongst the highest minimum wages of any businesses, and certainly in their sectors in the 80s and the 90s, it did not mean that their union density decreased. It did not mean that their experience of strike action was any less than an employer who had a minimum wage half of what those companies did. So in as much as we talk about collective bargaining and what is a good rate and what isn't, and what's fair and what isn't, I think we must also bear in mind that the extent to which a fair or a less fair or a reasonable or a less reasonable wage increase point is reached, that does not necessarily translate into industrial peace, in my experience. Okay, so perhaps just one or two reflections regarding this year so far, in my estimation. So we've spoken about the pent-up and the grown, the resentment and the frustration that Labour has experienced in the last couple of years for obvious reasons. A couple of things that I think are interesting. The one is that if we look at the use of power by trade unions, I was very struck by the Eskom strike and that collective bargaining process, because I think we learned a lot, and it was very interesting. I'm not too sure if we should or should not have been as surprised at the outcomes, but be that as it may, for me, what was interesting was here, as you will have seen, we had a situation where we had an essential service entity in the form of Eskom, a wage dispute, an unlawful, unprotected strike. We all know that in law, that could have resulted in the dismissal of large numbers of employees. But the fact of the matter there for me was, I think there was some good and some bad in this. I think if you are a union sympathizer, or if your ideology is along the lines of union interest and employee interest, then I think you'd have to say to yourself that organized labor played that collective bargaining process very well, very, very well, because they knew that they were hitting Eskom at the worst possible time for Eskom. We were at roundabout stage 6 outages. They are relatively skilled. It's a relatively skilled workforce. It would have been a real own goal to start talking about disciplining and dismissing those strikers, even though, and notwithstanding the fact that they were striking unlawfully and in an unprotected way. So I would have to give NUMSA 10 out of 10 for the way they managed it. But of course, there's a caveat here. It was unlawful and it was unprotected, and that's not the way you're supposed to do these things. And that's not the rules of the game. But if you're looking at from a raw power point of view, did this trade union make reasonable strides in the interest of its members in difficult circumstances? Then the answer has to be yes. And I think that was a smart, if unlawful, and as a largely employer advisor, in many ways, unimpressive way of behaving, they nonetheless managed to achieve reasonably significant gains for their members in the course of that process. Now, if you contrast that with the hospitality sector, whom we also do, and we do a lot of work in that area too. And those of you who have, as from the outside looking in, or those of you who may be involved in the hospitality industry will know, as I think we all do, it was hugely ravaged by COVID. It's still not back to pre-COVID levels. And organized labor knows and understands that those that operate in that industry and in that sector. So you see relative inactivity, because at the moment the focus is not on collective bargaining. In fact, the focus is not even on avoiding dismissals and retrenchments. It's a question of trying to regrow that the employment within that industry as quickly as possible. So two different ways of two unions or union sectors or organized labor in two different sectors that understand when they can and can't exert the power that they undoubtedly have. And labor is, hospitality is highly unionized, and when they choose to exercise their power, they can do so very significantly. I think another theme for me, and I won't take too much longer, another theme for me is quite interesting, is the subject of above inflation increases. In such a volatile interest rate environment, I think labor must be cautious in labeling any increase above inflation at the moment. And there are lots of examples of this. ArcelorMittal 6.5% in May, Eskom 7% in July, Sibanye-Stillwater Gold 5% in year one, 5.5% in year two. Now in May, if I look at the CPI stats that Stats South Africa gives us, in May our CPI was 6.5%. In June it was 7.4%, and the latest I've got for July is 7.8%. So none of those increases, well, they were for a couple of hours, but they weren't above inflation for very long. And I don't know the extent to which, if I look at that myself, I don't know the extent to which organized labor really factors that into their thinking. I mean, if I was a union organizer going into wage negotiations in Q2 this year, even Q1, even now, I'd be saying to myself, hang on a second, let's not hang our hat on what inflation is today, because, you know, we're going to wake up tomorrow morning, it's probably going to go up, and it's probably going to go up for the foreseeable future. So as I've said here, you know, it's arguable that the increases, which are nonetheless laudable in the current economic circumstances, I think we must be quick, mustn't be so quick as to label them as being above inflation. Finally, maybe a couple of other thoughts which I think are maybe helpful and have been in my experience as well, is almost the reappearance of the multi-year deal. Now, in years gone by, we would go from 1 to 2 to 3 years. And in my experience, the 3-year deal was a good thing. It took time for labor to come to terms with that. But now we're seeing 5-year deals. We've had a 5-year deal at Anglo-American Platinum. There's also a 5-year deal at Northern. There's a 5-year deal at Impala Platinum. And I think that's very interesting, because that does give a degree of stability when it comes to the collective bargaining environment. And maybe finally, I think unsurprisingly, we have a probability of a failed collective bargaining process in the public sector. And the reason I don't think we should be surprised, there are a couple of factors. I think firstly, the judgment, maybe my colleagues can comment on this, but the judgment relating to the failure to pay year 3 in the 3-year agreement, collective agreement, I thought was wrong, because I thought it hugely undermined the collective bargaining process and broke a lot of trust that had been built up over time. And I think that's a price that's going to be paid, certainly in the public sector, for some time to come. So I'm going to stop it there. I think my 10 minutes I might have gone over. I apologize, but I hope that's just some value to make a contribution today.
Thank you very, very much, Tony. Very interesting. And what really strikes me is the value of having a grasp of some basic economics. So we run a course called Economic Literacy, and understanding the interplay between inflation, growth, interest rates, export performance, and wage negotiations, and perhaps an area that we can encourage people to explore with us. I'm going to turn to William. And William, you're going to focus on the Code of Good Practice and some other features of our legal framework in which, or the context in which, collective bargaining takes place.
Thank you, Felicity, and good morning to everybody. And I just had a look at the folk who are part of the chat, and certainly there's a lot of colleagues that I recognized from organized labor, from employer, public sector, private sector, academics, and others too. So very good morning to all of you, and also those of you who are following on the live stream at the moment too. Felicity, yes, and I thought a good place, well, not a good place to start, but just maybe a very real place to start, is to say that within the last few weeks, and some of you are actually in the webinar right now at the moment, is that I very sadly, after a 2-day process in a very, very large public sector organization with organized labor, various unions, after lots of problem solving and negotiating and mediating, I was called in as the mediator in that wage dispute, issued a certificate of non-resolution at the end of it. And when I stepped away, as mediators, much as we self-reflect, there's maybe something behind it where we'd love to be able to try and build the peace and make the peace and mediate and kind of, as William Ury and Roger Fisher in their book called Getting to Yes, help the parties to get to yes. But what I did need to realize, Felicity and just my colleagues, is that I do also recall, and we use it sometimes in our training, what we call the conflict path. What are the underlying issues? And in South Africa, we have inequality, we have poverty, we have extreme unemployment, very low economic growth, and then added to that, a lot of anger with very legitimate reason. And we're bringing those parties together to go into negotiations. And so those are some of the underlying issues. And then what are some of the things that trigger the conflicts? And when we get into negotiations, and there might even be parties coming in with agendas, parties coming in very positionally, as Felicity's been speaking about, and other issues as well. And then there's certain issues which we call that aggravate the conflict as well, and make it a lot worse. And it can often be where I speak about the code of good practice now, and it could be things, Felicity, like not disclosing information to the parties not trusting each other, the parties not respecting each other, and a whole host of other factors that, when I speak about the code of good practice now, having that there as well. And so, although there was the sadness of issuing that certificate, I realized this is where the parties, and some of you are in this webinar at the moment, this is where the parties are at the moment. Even if we'd gone on for a few more days in that process, this is where we'd gotten to. The parties were very, very far apart, just to protect the confidentiality of the parties. There were double-digit figures, and there were figures that were right down, very close to the sort of the zero as well. And it really was where the employer was making out a very strong case in terms of its inability to pay, and even with the disclosing of financial details, and then also the elected leadership making out also very good cause for what the needs were in terms of wages and other terms and conditions. I now want to just come to another piece that, in fact, in 2019, when the ILO was celebrating its centenary, at the University of Pretoria, Judge Andre van Niekerk made a comment, and I think it's very pertinent at the moment too. And many of you will know Judge van Niekerk, and he just said, and I quote him, he says, "You can't legislate good industrial relations." He said, "You can have the finest act, but the answer to sound labor relations has to be found elsewhere." And that comes to another process that Felicity just mentioned that Mohammed Rajah and I had been involved in just over a week ago, another very, very big organization in the public sector, also with organized labor, almost 70 people in that process, almost an even split between the parties. And in the, it was a relationship building process that Mohammed and I facilitated there, was where we spoke and where the parties through this process indicated that the two biggest areas that they felt needed to be addressed to build the trust, they said the big outcome that we want from this process is to build trust. And so Mohammed and I said, well, look, if we just focused on building the trust, we need to look at how do we build the trust? And two major issues that came out. One was we need to improve communication between the parties. We need to respect each other. We need to share information. We need to have structures and places where we can communicate on a regular basis and we can dialogue with each other, whether it's consulting or negotiating and doing that. Secondly, this party also had national bargaining forums. They said we need to look at our collective bargaining structures as well. And we need to make sure that people have the capacity in terms of from a training point of view, the actual knowledge, and Felicity even made reference to economic literacy and a few other areas there too. So can we have the finance knowledge? Can we have the economic knowledge? Can we have some of those other, that part of the knowledge? Can we also learn some of the interactive skills? And this wonderful book, and I did refer to it earlier, Getting to Yes, there's 4 key principles. Separate people from the problem, separate positions from needs and interests, and try and look at what are the underlying needs and interests of the parties, the kind of the mutual gains. And the third and the fourth is let's brainstorm and generate a variety of possible options there. And then we'll use certain types of criteria that we'll look at and we'll determine it in terms of almost like a SWOT analysis. What's the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and threats in these different alternatives that we have here? And interestingly, one of the authors in that book, Getting to Yes, wrote another book, I think it was around about 2015, called Getting to Yes with Yourself. And the reason I'm sharing that and there are also TED Talks on these particular ones here, is William Ury says, before I can go into a negotiation, and I have the privilege of being a part-time senior commissioner in the CCMA, as Mahamed Rajah is too, and also engaging with new commissioners in the CCMA. And when we train conciliators and mediators and negotiators, is saying, before we can go in and negotiate, before we can mediate, before we can conciliate, have I gotten to yes with myself? You know, am I coming in there being able to be independent and objective and impartial in this particular process? And that goes for what we call both our verbal and our non-verbal interaction with the parties. And so, Felicity, what I just really want to do is I'm going to jump up at the stage. I've put a little picture up on the slide over here. I'll bring it a little bit closer to the light there. Parties can sort of see it a little bit. It's basically, some of you might have been, I've also participated in, the CCMA has a memorandum of understanding with, thank you, there it is. The CCMA has a memorandum of understanding with 7 public universities in South Africa, offering a certificate or postgraduate course in labor dispute resolution practice, where academics from those institutions, as well as commissioners from the CCMA, train on the modules CCMA commissioners get trained on to become commissioners. And for more of that information, you could have a look at the CCMA website and see which are the universities participating. But this is a couple of the universities that I've been involved in participating with, is drawing that picture of our Labour Relations Act of 1995 and looking particularly at Section 1 of the Act and the legs that are here. And right at the outset, just having a look at our LRA, and right at the outset in Section 1 of our LRA, the purpose. The purpose is to advance economic development, which is the first leg over here, social justice, labor peace, and then workplace democracy, democratization of the workplace. And then if I just come down a little bit under Section 1, specifically to under that labor peace section over there, just perhaps before I go to that, there's a paper that we have on the Conflict Dynamics website that was in the August newsletter of Conflict Dynamics, focusing specifically on the theme of collective bargaining. And the topic is, where are we at with collective bargaining in South Africa so far this year? And so that is on the Conflict Dynamics website there in that paper. And right in the opening, we just say, with the quadruple challenge in South Africa, we used to talk about the triple challenge of inequality, poverty, and unemployment. We call it the quadruple challenge because of the lack of economic growth and development. And this is so pertinent for collective bargaining, where we're trying to generate economic growth and development. We're trying to attract investment. We're trying to have strong, sustainable, stable organizations. And then on the other side, we're dealing with social justice issues of inequality, poverty, and extreme unemployment. And as Tony was talking about a little bit earlier, whether we're comparing the 1980s or during the apartheid era and societal, civil, political issues being brought into collective bargaining, or whether we're looking now in 2022 at the challenges that people are facing from unemployment, from inequality, and the extremeness of that. Just recently, we witnessed video footage at the Steve Schweter municipality in Middelburg in Mpumalanga, of where more and more private security agencies, police and others, and we're seeing the loss of life and limb in processes. Just recently, through Conflict Dynamics and one of the very big mining companies with a number of unions in another province, just recently too, where there was a strike. Tony was also speaking about that, where this was interestingly an unprotected strike. And again, private security, police and others were being called in. And when I go back to what Judge Andre van Niekerk said around specifically, you can't legislate good industrial relations. You can have the most amazing constitution in the world, and Section 23, the right to labor relations, the right there. You can have the most amazing Labor Relations Act that sets up under labor peace, the CCMA, the bargaining councils, conciliation and arbitration. You can have accredited private dispute resolution agencies, and you can have all of that in place. But how come we have the kind of collective bargaining that we're seeing at the moment, which is not very focused on needs and interests, on mutual gains, and very often it is in that very positional kind of one. And then what I've done just next to the Labour peace leg over there is I put two little asterisks there. And the first one is around in section 1, in the purpose, is speaking about dropping down to section 1D. And section 1D speaks, which I've just set up here, section 1D of the Labour Relations Act, where the drafters of the act that came out in 1995, in line with what was already the 1994 draft constitution and the Labour Relations Act and the Bill of Rights, is we want to promote in section 1D orderly collective bargaining, and it puts it right out there. Then collective bargaining at a sectoral level, and we have members of bargaining councils who are with us at the moment. And then number 3 and number 4, which speaks about employee participation in decision-making in the workplace. I'm going to repeat that. Section 1D3, employee participation in decision-making in the workplace. And I'm going to add these words: meaningful, participative, engaging, information is shared, parties are capacitated, and they're able to engage in that kind of discussion. And then lastly, the effective resolution of labour disputes. And maybe, Robin, if you can just pop up those, there were just 3 very brief slides that we put onto PowerPoint there. And the first one is just a quick summary of what I said there, section 1D, there we are, to promote, those areas there. And particularly the 3rd and the 4th one, employee participation in the decision-making in the workplace. And so often the breakdowns come with the lack of trust, the lack of respect, the lack of sharing of information, the lack of training people, and equipping in content type information around operational issues, economic issues, financial issues, and then also just the interpersonal skills in being able to gauge in that creative problem solving way. Robin, let's go to the next slide. There we go, and we see now what I'm reaching for here is the Code of Good Practice on Collective Bargaining. And back to that article, which is on the Conflict Dynamics website, is that what we mention in that article there is how, to quote the words there, is that we are in the country, we're in one of the most challenging and difficult periods, and the social partners in the public and the private sectors meeting across and around negotiation tables. And the words are with mandates from constituencies, whether they are workers, are employees, whether they're boards and others, with very little room for flexibility or to maneuver, or what we could call very, very little wiggle room. And this was completely the case just a few weeks ago, meeting with these parties, even over 2 days, to try and find and problem solving the gap between the parties where they were at. And just finding that it was so wide that the parties needed to go back to their respective constituencies to get fresh mandates. But it was just very, very little, if I could almost say, almost no room within those current mandates. And I'm using the word the current mandate because as we left and the parties left, the encouragement was to continue discussions, continue negotiations. Back in 2011, there was in Gallagher Estate in Midrand in Gauteng, there was what we called a CCMA 15-year think tank, where the parties came together as organized labor, government and business to discuss, 15 years of the CCMA, what's working and what are the other things the CCMA can do. CCMA is the busiest dispute resolution organization in the world, and does very, very well with dispute resolution in conciliation and mediation, arbitration, and has just also recently, compliments to the CCMA, of a clean audit as well, and really absolutely functions impeccably, and it's a role model for the rest of the world, and was celebrated by the ILO in 2019 as an example in the world of a dispute resolution body and mechanism that provides social justice and access to parties to come there. And one of the areas that was identified in 2011 was to say, CCMA, in your discretionary function, there's a mandatory function, to do conciliation and arbitration, and there's other specific mandatory functions. And then in the discretionary function, which is more around dispute prevention, in training and capacity building and doing relationship building and building workplace relations there too. And the CCMA has been very good at that, and along with other private dispute resolution organizations and with Conflict Dynamics, running relationship building processes to bring parties together to look at the state. And this is what Mahamed and I were involved in just within the last few weeks, with parties saying, we want to discuss what's working, what's not working, how can we build the trust, how can we improve the dialogue. And what came out, Felicity, from that particular one was that we need to train and capacitate parties in particularly negotiation skills. We need to set up structures to communicate on a more regular basis. Professor Clive Thomson, who's appeared within the last year in some of the other conflict dynamics webinars, in a wonderful book that came out recently called Liber Abicorum, Manfred Weiss, where a number of people wrote articles in tribute to Professor Manfred Weiss, who was very instrumental in the drafting of our Labour Relations Act and bringing in the mechanisms and the machinery within our LRA, and including an area based on practice elsewhere in the world, that section on workplace forums. And Professor Clive Thomson writes a wonderful paper with a wonderful chapter in the book where he talks about cooperation in the workplace, the South African flag never unfurled, and goes into speak where the intention was to have collaboration on an ongoing kind of basis, and has also spoken and said, you know, we have this collective bargaining event that generally happens once a year, and the parties leave everything. We go into collective bargaining. In the CCMA, we also speak about the pre-collective bargaining season, the post-collective bargaining season. And I hate to mention this, but in South Africa, we also talk about strike season. You know, we use that terminology, strike season, as if it's inevitable that that is also part and parcel of what goes on there. And what Professor Clive Thomson speaks about is, he says, you know, if we were to look at what was the intention of the LRA, the intention of the LRA was to have in section 1D, orderly collective bargaining, and at a sectoral level as well. And in addition to collective bargaining, to have communication that could happen throughout the year between parties who share information and they participate in these discussions. And that was very much what Mahamed, Rajah and myself were involved in with this very, very big organization and organized labor just within a very short recent time too. And interestingly, in addition to that, Mahamed, what we also looked at was, besides the need to improve and have formal communication structures where there's meaningful shared information, is that we also need to, and the training for collective bargaining and having our bargaining forum structures, the parties also identified the need for their recognition agreement, their collective agreement, and agreeing policies and procedures and within that agreement. And then just coming back very briefly to the slide, sorry, Robin, if we can just go back to that slide just quickly before that, is the purpose of the Code of Good Practice. In 2014, President Ramaphosa, then Deputy President, called an urgent summit, NEDLAC summit, in Ekurhuleni, in what was the original World Trade Center, where the Constitution was negotiated, and had it at Emperor's Palace there, where parties came together and, looking at the state of collective bargaining, drafted or started, and the seeds were sown for what I'm holding up over here, a Code of Good Practice on collective bargaining. And in that Code of Good Practice, which is not only on collective bargaining, it's also on industrial action and picketing, is that we see there right at the outset, the purpose is to promote that orderly bargaining, the bargaining at a sectoral level, employee participation, the effective and very proactive resolution of labor disputes. Robin, let's just pop to the next slide, which I think is the last slide, is the, sorry, let's just go back one slide before that. Yes, so there's the actual purpose of the Code of Good Practice. It's to strengthen and promote orderly collective bargaining by promoting the trust, the mutual understanding, and the constructive engagement. Very much the items that came out with Mahamed and I in these last few weeks, and with parties even in mediation just within the last few weeks as well. And the second point there, the maximum involvement of workers and worker representatives in negotiation, informed, maximum involvement, and doing that. Just the last slide, Robin, there is just that the Code of Good Practice speaks to the principles of good faith bargaining, development of support for negotiators, also preparing, as Felicity said, often having a pre-meeting, coming together, the use of facilitators, the disclosure of information, and even makes facility for a good faith declaration. And just on that point on the use of facilitators, is with parties coming in with very low trust and often anger and whatever the state of the relations are between those negotiators, is very often the calling in, and we found this very recently, of independent facilitators. The parties agree to. Those facilitators can play a role of problem solving and helping the parties not to get stuck. But it's absolutely crucial that those facilitators are completely respected and trusted by the parties. Felicity, I think that brings it to a close for me on that there, before we go into discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William. That's great. And that really, sets out our context very, very clearly, not only the LRA, but the code of good practice. Mahamed, I want to turn to you for your focus, particularly on the role of facilitators, because as William has said, you've recently been involved in that role quite a number of times between parties. And what can a facilitator bring to the collective bargaining process that might make it more effective?
Thank you and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. Robin, if we can go to the slide, I think it's slide number 9. Yeah, and this, to make it easy for myself, I contacted a union that usually uses me, that often says, please, you must come and assist. And I said to him, please let me know why do you want me to facilitate? Why don't you do it on your own? And this was his response. And he says, well, for a start, we trust you. As William said, that's a requirement. And the employer trusts you as well, because you've done it for us several times. And we can't do it on our own. He says, the first important point, he says, it reduces unnecessary conflict between the parties. And I said, please explain that to me. He says, well, during the process, not only do you act as a facilitator of the meeting, but we've given you the mandate to mediate as well. So often during the facilitation process, we'll break up into side meetings when I see that they're sort of reaching a deadlock, and then the mediation process kicks in. He says it ensures orderly collective bargaining because you are there. Every time we say something that we shouldn't, you bring us to order. You ensure that meeting rules are abided by. If we were left on our own, it sometimes becomes a bun fight. And because you are there, we are aware of that. And obviously, we therefore respect the process. He says you, as facilitator, and he says, even if it had been another facilitator, facilitators ensure that we stick to the issues that are there. It enables the parties to focus on the matters for collective bargaining without muddling it with other issues. Because often when people are negotiating, when they're bargaining collectively, they will bring in other issues that are not relevant for the bargaining issue. And that will come up. And he says, as facilitators, you assist with that process. He added, he says, it enables parties to seek advice or bounce off ideas from the facilitator on side meetings. As I said, we sometimes would mediate and we'd be in side meetings, and the side meetings, as I think most people know, are confidential, and they would bounce off ideas of, and sometimes they would even ask for advice, but obviously we don't give the advice, but we allow them to bounce ideas of us. And we allow them, and we facilitate a bit of a brainstorming within the side meeting so that they could come to the decision that they are comfortable with. He says, because you keep us in order, because you focus on the issues, it expedites the conclusion of the collective bargaining process. If we were left on our own, it would go on and on and on. But you ensure that we stick to the issues at hand. You ensure that we bargain what is on the table and not bring in other unnecessary issues. And he says, but very important for us is that side meeting where we can bounce ideas off the facilitator. It really assists a great deal. Felicity, I just want to add one or two things. An important thing is that I've noticed recently, and Tony raised that, is this multi-party multi-term agreements and the public service. And it's unfortunate, I agree, that the court had to interfere, because collective bargaining should be left to the parties and it shouldn't interfere. But because of that ruling, other organizations, including one of the big universities that I was involved in, had a multi-term agreement. And clearly they couldn't afford the third year because of COVID. And they then used that court case to put pressure on the unions to say, well, the court is in favor and therefore we can do it. So, Tony, I agree with you totally. The court shouldn't interfere. It should be left to the parties, because that's what industrial democracy is about. I mean, that's 101 industrial relations, is industrial democracy and collective bargaining. Let the parties deal with it and we will not interfere. I think because of time, I'll stop there, Felicity. There are questions. I saw there was a question by Mashia, and that adds to what William said. He said there's a need for economic literacy, and I totally agree with that, Mr. Mashia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mahamed. That is really helpful. I know you've just made a point that has escaped me, and I wanted to follow up on. But let me pick up on a couple of other things. And this is to Tony. Oh yes, I wanted to say that we've had a number of points made in the chat about getting a copy of the slides and the recording. And of course, we always send that through to all participants after the course, so after the webinar, so you will receive that. The other point was, Mahamed, you mentioned the role of the courts. And on our website, you will find an article by Ingrid Lewin, where she talks about, she cites the recent cases in relation to particularly the code, because in our most recent newsletter, we were really trying to focus on the code of good practice, and she focuses in on that. And so have a look at that. And most of the decisions, as I recall, are related to the unprotected feature of industrial action and pickets and violence, etc. So have a look at that. That's a useful resource. And just generally, we'd encourage you to sign up to our newsletter. At the bottom of our website page, you can sign up to our newsletter because each month we tackle an issue pertinent to dispute resolution or labor relations, and articles by William, Mahamed and others have been featured. Tony, yeah, back to you on trying to make a connection between some of the points that William and Mahamed have made and your experience of collective bargaining over the last year or two. Are parties engaging on the code and following those principles regarding pre-meetings and disclosure of information and the good faith declaration? What are you seeing in practice?
I was half hoping I didn't get a question on this, in the sense that I heard William discussing it with understandable enthusiasm. However, if I look at my own experience, the code is not central, or is not as central as it should be in the minds of the parties when they are negotiating. I don't come across the code very often. I've never been involved in a declaration of good faith process. I do, of course, know the code. I fully appreciate the intent behind the code and all the other codes at the back of the LRA. I get it fully, but to answer your question, I don't come across the code. I rarely come across a reference to the code in the collective bargaining process.
Yeah, it's been around for quite some time. I think, William, did you say 2018? And I'm also just struck by how little we hear about it, because there's some really useful points there. And I wonder, Mahamed and William, whether you can comment in your experience on what difference, where you've seen it implemented, where you've seen a declaration of good faith and other aspects, what difference has it made?
William, you want to go first? You are muted.
Sorry, I was just going to suggest, Mahamed, would you like to go first? And then yes, okay.
Okay, should I? Okay, I will. I agree with Tony. It hardly ever comes up. I mean, I'm sure if you did a poll now, Felicity, a great number of people will say, we don't know the code. I know sort of many people don't know the code, and even if they do, it's sort of there in the background, it's something there, but it's not something that plays a part in collective bargaining, not at the bargaining councils, not in private collective bargaining.
And yet it is so helpful.
And it is, and sometimes when we do the section 150s, when the strike is on at the CCMA, we do remind parties of that, and then it assists a bit to nudge people to sort of behave themselves at the bargaining table, not that they totally comply with it. Yeah.
William, anything to add? William, you're on mute. And please, participants, feel free to add some questions in the Q&A. We haven't got anything in the Q&A. We've had a few comments in the chat there.
Felicity, I'm going to pick up on somebody who's spoken on previous webinars with us, Mkulu Mashia, the General Secretary of the Transnet Bargaining Council. And Mkulu, you're part of our group this morning. And I know that you, with an organized labor trade union background, have spoken so much about the need for collaborative engagement places in workplaces. And you've spoken very highly about the link between relationship building processes and often training capacity building, and then the effective engagement in collective bargaining processes. And so, Felicity, it was actually at the end of 2018 when the former minister of, which is now Employment and Labour, Minister Tudor Mclesi, his predecessor, Mildred Oliphant, I'm just looking at the Gazette here, signed the Code of Good Practice into Gazette on the 12th of December 2018. And I remember another colleague of mine, and I'll mention him if he's watching, Kaiser Tabedi, and I were asked to facilitate another very big process in Gauteng with 4 unions. And we introduced to the parties this draft, it hadn't yet been enacted or gazetted yet, Code of Good Practice. And would the parties be at all interested in working, and they decided we're going to work as a coalition of trade unions. They decided that instead of being 4, and they came from 4 quite different backgrounds in terms of the bargaining unit and the constituencies they were representing. And they said that there's a certain overlap and we'd like to work as a coalition of trade unions. And we set some terms of reference. And then we said, would you like to have a look at this draft code, which then actually became gazetted during the process? Would you like to engage? Because on the page 38 of the code, there is what we call the good faith declaration. I'm just turning to it very quickly here. It's 2 pages of just saying, it's the annexure A, and it's called the Good Faith Declaration, where parties, they say, in light of this code, we are committing to the following. Mahamed and I were involved just very recently now with a very big entity and organized labor, where they want to conclude their relationship building process by making a pledge to each other. And Mahamed and I pointed out that this is not necessarily dealing with the items they've identified in the RBO that need attention. But what they were saying is we're going to make a pledge to each other. And they itemized, Mahamed, I think it was 7 or 8 points of we pledging the following way of engaging each other. And what I have had, Felicity, with different parties is where parties might, as you say, Tony, haven't heard about the code, or we talk about the code, or might even be reluctant to take on the code until they've gone back to their respective constituency. And then I often get this question about what status does the code carry? Is it primary law? Is it secondary law? What is it? But what is very interesting right at the beginning of the code is where it speaks very much, in that interpreting statutes, what is mandatory and what's discretionary. And right at the outset of the code, it says, Section 1, Item 1, Subsection 2, any person interpreting the Labour Relations Act 66 of 1995 must take this code into account. And then by looking at the code and what the purpose of the code is, to build trust, to have maximum involvement of employees and other parties to the process, and then absolutely, as Felicity mentioned earlier, the disclosure of information between the parties. And then it also talks about capacitating, often using joint training programs with employers and with Labour, coming on joint training, and then also recommends this facilitation, which in a way is bringing in an uninvolved, when I say uninvolved, a neutral, independent facilitator who's going to have credibility, who can help those parties with problem solving. And just a few weeks ago, in this very big public sector wage dispute with organized labor, what I felt in terms of no matter how far apart the parties were, is that the only way forward in this dispute is going to be problem solving. And it's going to be the parties applying a way of engaging what was going to be there. And my sense is that at some stage, this big organization and organized labor are going to get to a point of finding each other. But in that journey getting there is going to be the problem solving, which the code puts in there and says to the parties, would you like to in good faith? And some are a little bit scared to do that because what are we committing to? Others are saying we're very happy to do that. And Felicity, I've certainly come across a number of parties in the public and the private sector who have adopted the code, who've taken the good faith declaration, they've even crafted into their own words. And the outcome to that has been a very different way of engaging. Some that are saying that in the past, we just reached deadlock, very unimaginative, very uncreative. Now what we're doing is we're finding a way of being more innovative, more creative, sharing more information. And it very definitely almost reduces the risks, you know, and helps the parties in terms of being able to engage in a more problem-solving kind of way. It's not the panacea, it doesn't meet all things, but it's certainly a tool that can be used there.
Yeah, we talk in our training and our approach to labor relations about process versus outcome. And, you know, we've seen the outcomes of collective bargaining, both in terms of the settlement figures, the rates, and Tony asks an interesting question about whether those are really as effective as they might have been, considering what inflation is likely to be in a few months' time. But we also know that the process that was followed to get to many of the outcomes was highly conflictual and extremely damaging for workers and for the companies, organizations. And, you know, there are calculations you can do to determine actually what the value of the outcome truly was, given the loss of wages to workers. And generally the outcome is, if there's been any industrial action, the real outcome is much less value than it appears because of the loss of wages. So what the code is promoting is not a, and I think unions often fear a kind of sellout, a kind of that the union is, and maybe that's part of the inter-union rivalry situation we're seeing at the moment, that where unions try to be more collaborative and follow these principles, they might be, the fear is they might be regarded as having kind of sold out. And there's certainly, you know, that is something that employers need to be alive to, and how they work with trade unions is to recognize the independence and the legitimate independence of trade unions and the legitimate place of power. But that takes us back to the code, and where is this legitimate place of power? And you know, William made the point earlier about how sometimes people have to go through a power play to get to an outcome. But Thokozana has asked a question which I want Tony to answer, and that has to do with the implications of a failure to adhere to the code. Because if you do go through a power play, and let's say it's protected, that you haven't followed the code, what are the legal implications?
Well, my understanding is, and just going back to also, you know, William makes the point that right at the beginning of the code, it does state that the code must be taken into consideration. And that is important. it really raises the question of, generally, when it comes to all of the codes, the status of the code in relation to the Act and the point of it being primary or secondary law. And even in terms of that wording, what does take into consideration mean? You know, does it mean that, to come back to your question, Felicity, that by failing to comply with the code, you are in breach of legislation, of the Act itself? I'm not so sure. I mean, in my experience, if I look at the codes in general, and I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists have to say about this. But the codes are not especially legislation. They are codes of good practice. So I would, and everything's arguable, I would sense that it's not unlawful to fail to act in accordance with the code. That would be my sense. That would be my argument. But you know, I've also heard cogent arguments to say the opposite. But my own view is you're not in breach of legislation when you're in breach of the code.
Just looking at Ingrid Lewin's article, which, as I say, is on our website, she says that there are very few cases relating specifically to collective bargaining stipulations in the code. Most of the cases relative to the code involve misconduct during picket and breach of picketing rules. And then she refers to Johannesburg Road Agency and SAMWU 2020 and says that, just getting it very quickly, the respondents were referred to the Code of Good Practice collective bargaining, which emphasizes the need for orderly conduct. Said the court, a strike is meant to be an extension of collective bargaining, not a license for trashing the employer's premises. And so I'd urge people to have a look at those decisions. As I say, there are not many, but I can see at least two on a quick scan that have made specific reference to the code. But let me check, William, being our other lawyer on the panel, what is your view on that? Oh, you're on mute.
Felicity, I certainly concur with what has been said there, and it takes me back to that Judge Van Niekerk's one about not legislating. You know, we can have a wonderful constitution, LRA, we can have codes, and yes, Tony, I mean, you know, to go to court and fight over you did or you didn't, you know, take it into consideration. I mean, the amount of time and energy and stuff, and that comes back to what he's talking about, not legislating the stuff. And then I'm also just looking from that same book, Lega Abecorum, where a number of, if any of you haven't, and it's not a plug for the book, I've got no royalties with it whatsoever, but some of amazing people who've written pieces. And one of them is by Charles Newpin as well, who was also director of the CCMA and also director of IMSA at some stage. And he just says, if there was ever a time for the social partners, if they needed to reframe, pull together and chart a different course, it is now. And speaks about employers and unions in South African workplaces will, you know, to embark on this. And that is very much the kind of process that Mahamed and I were involved in, you know, just in the last few weeks, and more and more and more, is I, as a practicing attorney, I've, as we all have, been involved in where the law says certain things, whether it's protected, unprotected, or whatever the case might say. And we see this even out of the labor relations arena, is that these discussions that we're needing to have, we've got the framework, we've got the laws, we've got the statutes, we've even got collective agreements, we've got policies, we've got procedures, but that is the frameworks that are there. We are needing the relationships, we're needing the trust, we're needing the respect, we're needing to sit down and negotiate and collaborate and co-create and co-determine, and that is going to happen by going to the root cause of what the conflict is in that particular workplace, that particular industry, or that particular sector, through relationship building, developing these forums and these discussion ones there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that is a good place perhaps to draw things to a close, and it's a point that is echoed in the chat by Tibisha Sizwe, who says that perhaps what is really central to all of this is the lack of trust, and a lack of trust not only between labour and management, but also a lack of trust in our society that bleeds into labour relations, as he says. And yes, Tony made some points about, and I think we've all made points about our context and the interplay that there has been, for many, many years between the political and the economic factors and the environment. And really, until we can address the bigger picture, or as we address the bigger picture, the relationships in the workplace, including collective bargaining, will continue to be strained and be a challenge. In conflict dynamics, well, we first of all would urge people to look at the code and continue to follow what the LRA and the code gives us, that amazing framework which William has got on his flip chart behind him. But also to consider some of the efforts that you can make to address these challenges, be it through training, joint training. William's mentioned union management training is very helpful, not only in understanding the principles of effective negotiation and developing skills, but also just in creating an opportunity for labour and management to work together in that training course and to begin to develop some foundations of trust. But also we've heard the value and the use of a facilitator, and the value also of the mediation services offered by private agencies and also the CCMA. And Mthimkhulu Mashia has made a point about it's not only on the union side where there is tension and rivalry, but on the employer side, the way in which employers often play one another off against each other, off against one another in terms of settlements and approaches to labour relations can undermine orderly and peaceful collective bargaining. So I'm going to draw things to a close, and I'm going to do it by just asking each of our panelists to make one final, literally, sentence in closing to wish everybody well, one piece of advice perhaps to wish people well in going forward with the remaining couple of months of collective bargaining this year. And so let's start at the other end. Mahamed, let me start with you.
Yeah, okay, there was a lot of talk of worker participation, and for me it's sad we've got a whole chapter in the labor relations, chapter 5, that deals with workplace forums, and I think if somehow we could get that to work, and we know the reasons why it isn't working, but if we could get that to work, I think we could build more worker participation into the workplace, and I think that would be useful.
Yeah.
But
so
thank you for having me on, and everybody go well.
Thank you, Mahamed. So having another stream, not just collective bargaining, but a stream for a more regular interaction where trust can be built on a less conflict-driven basis. Then William, you're on mute.
Thank you. Just very briefly, going back to this table at the back here of the economic development, dealing with inequality, poverty, unemployment, and economic development here. And that we in South Africa have workplaces in the public and the private sector where the parties have come together and engaged each other in incredibly co-determined, co-creative ways. We have a motor car in this country that is manufactured, that is the highest standard in the whole world compared with 3 other countries, including Germany, that's often projected as where there's excellence there. And this is with organized labor and with management. And that's not the only industry and the only sector. And that has been where elected leadership has come together in forums, in workplaces, through collective bargaining structures, and been able to, in the getting to yes, separate people from the problem and really look at what are the underlying needs and interests. How can we have a mutual gain here? And then coming up with very, very collaborative, co-determined ideas that have led to increasing economic development and being able to address the unemployment and stability and the sustainability there.
Thank you, William. And Tony, to you for a last word.
Well, I can't really add any more than my colleagues have added in terms of the trust and the participation. Maybe something unrelated to that. I've always felt that one needs to try and keep one's negotiating cycle as short as possible, because, of course, the collective bargaining process does affect the equilibrium of the business in many ways. And I've never felt that an unnecessarily long negotiating cycle has ever been helpful.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all participants. Thank you panelists, and we look forward to further engagement with you, and please feel free to contact us. We will send you a link to the recording and a link to the slides. And we look forward to continuing this conversation and to all of us being able to make a contribution to more effective collective bargaining in our country. Thank you very much.